holistic coverage of it. So journalists themselves finding themselves being held hostage by communities who feel that if they go this route, then they're able to tell their stories better and have their voices heard. On the upside, though, the quest for credible news has seen online news channels spike in their consumers, and that is a positive sign. But the downside again is, can you make these news platforms revenue viable? And I think that those will be some of the issues we discuss going forward. And then on the whole, to say that we've seen a lot of journalists being called to be out in the field, despite there being the lockdown prerogatives. Journalists are considered essential workers, so that means they have to risk their lives to be out there.
Mary, that's great. Can you, I wanted you to dig in just a bit to a couple of things that you said. You talked about the quest for credible news. What does that actually look like? So in your reporting, your analysis, as people are looking for credible news, how does that look? What are people turning to?
So if we look at the kinds of the realm and the reality of where we are at the moment is that people want news for use, i.e., the pandemic is a very uncertain scenario. You cannot plan for it. You cannot pre-plan for the outcome of it. So basically, what we're seeing is a lot of the public out there wants numbers. They're also looking to the media to give them information around how to mitigate the spread. They're also looking for information around the constitution of the pandemic, issues like numbers, the tangibles of figures, and the provision of the actual intimate details around the pandemic is what people want. Furthermore, they're also, and it's a tall ask for media, credible journalists are being called on to hold accountable institutions, individuals, governments, and all stakeholders involved in the story. So the accountability, the watchdog scenario, the situation around making sure that the facts and figures are real, and also their voices being heard is another thing that we're seeing. And journalists will constantly tell you that the pressure to be all things in information has been something that they've daily had to do with great courage, bravery, and conviction. But the most important aspect that we're seeing coming through is the actual fact checking. And that has meant that heavy resources under lockdown conditions have had to be forced, newsroom leaders have had to be forced to be very resourceful, put in schedules that accommodate this demand, and also make sure that whatever gets out in the public realm is credible, truthful, and honest.
There is a big new challenge because there's such a proliferation of false news. We've had this before, disinformation, misinformation in the past year or two in particular, and a lot of cyber trolling, targeting women journalists in particular, very nasty stuff that even heads into the physical realm of threats and intimidation. And that is an additional challenge because we're seeing a huge rise in sharing of fake and false information on WhatsApp groups, across Facebook, Instagram, across all these social media platforms. And newsrooms with their shrinking budgets and smaller teams simply don't have enough capacity to counter those as well. But there is a system, the real411.org website, which has been set up by Media Monitoring Africa with the support of SANEF and other organizations. And a lot of this misinformation, disinformation can get reported there. And then it gets reviewed by a panel of an editor, a lawyer, and a social media technology expert. And it's properly investigated, and a decision is made and then put out into the public sphere on the website for everyone to see what is the veracity of these things. But they are an additional heavy burden on the media, because while the journalists and the newsrooms are facing all these challenges, many reporters, as Mary said, are still going out across the country into rural areas, into townships, to tell the stories of people, to keep government mindful of the impact of their decisions on ordinary people. And that is a very crucial role, because we cannot have the top-down approach in news either. It's got to be telling the stories of the people. How is it affecting them? What do they need? What other information do they need? It has to be a response situation, very much interactive. So there are all these challenges, as well as people's own anxieties about whether they're going to get the virus, how to balance working from home and working online more, and not going to the office. And being, if you're a journalist, being shot at, as Mary said, we've had all these examples, journalists being shot at, beaten, chased, intimidated, one being forced to flee the country, even to Lesotho. So yes, there are lots of challenges. And nevertheless, though, journalists are telling really interesting human stories that are putting a human face on the virus, on how, what it feels like to get the virus, how it's impacted families, how the changing circumstances have affected people's family, friends, and social networks, their mental health as well. There's so many stories that have been done in such a compassionate way that I think is putting a face for people on this crisis.
Judy, you hit on something that I think is important, and that is the social media space, in particular WhatsApp. I think that a lot of people actually see what they get in their WhatsApp as a source of valid information. And in some cases, it is sort of a story that somebody has forwarded. But this must be a particular challenge for reporters, because in some ways it gets crowded out. Like actual reporting by reporters and journalists gets crowded out by what people see in their WhatsApp group. Talk about how media rooms and reporters deal with that.
As SANEF, we've encouraged newsrooms and editors to also make their audiences aware of a sort of checklist that they can use. Don't always rely on one source. Check credible sources. Don't go to these weird name things that look very odd and think that that's a story with veracity. And so all these things. And also, a lot of the WhatsApp false posts are written by people with agendas, but they're scarily believable sometimes, because they intertwine bits of the truth into the narrative. And if you dig deeper, but most people don't have the time, and there's such information overload, you can soon see where there's an agenda, and possibly even why it's there. Often it's a political agenda or a business agenda, or it's an agenda of someone who just wants to cause trouble or do something because they're bored. So we try to encourage that sort of checklist to be shared with audiences, so that people themselves are empowered to help them distinguish between truth and reality. And of course, as you know, there are many different truths. When we used to do as reporters vox pops in the streets, getting an opinion of the person on the street, when it used to be a very patriarchal society here and very racist, you'd often just get the views of a few white men. And obviously, when we became editors as women, we made sure that you get diverse views. You get young and old, you get men and women, you get different race groups, you get people with disability or people living with AIDS. You cannot just focus on one small section of society. And the problem, I think, is we're seeing a lot of people experiencing a bit of confirmed bias. They see a story that they think resonates with them. They share it quickly. But what they're doing is actually sharing the bias that they already have, if you like. And it is very difficult. They do need more tools to empower them to identify it. As you said, journalists themselves often have a problem. And that's what we're trying to do within SANEF too, is a lot more training, a lot more sharing of experiences to meet this challenge.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I just want to encourage our listeners out there, viewers out there, to please send in questions. This is an interactive session. Please feel free to ask anything. We'll be responsive to that, or even just send us an emoji, a thumbs up, a heart, a smiley face. Let us know how you're responding to what we're saying. I want to turn now to Raymond, who is at the Dennis Hurley Center, to speak about how things are sort of unfolding on the ground. People may not know, but Raymond and the Dennis Hurley Center have been on the ground in real time for a long time now. And so the situation under lockdown has changed some things, but it has not changed sort of the core of the work they're doing. So I wanted to hand off to Raymond to speak to that.
Thanks, Felix. Yes, I'm in the heart of Durban, running a centre working with homeless people and refugees. So in that respect, we are obviously consumers of media. We're trying to find out what's going on. We're intermediaries. People are often asking us to. Sorry, my camera keeps freezing. I do apologise for that. People often ask us to explain what's going on. So we're an intermediary between what we pick up from the media and what we pass on. And also we've been part of the story. And it's quite interesting actually having been very much part of the Durban story, which has had quite a lot of coverage, not just in regional media, but nationally because of what's been achieved here in providing emergency shelter for the homeless. Interesting to reflect on the difference between the story that's presented and what we know is really happening on the ground. One of the things which strikes me, and I say this, as you may have already guessed from my accent, as a non-South African who now lives here. I've been living in South Africa for 10.5 years, but I'm British by origin. There always seems to me a great pendulum in how South African media deals with almost everything, and it tends to go, it's always from saints to sinners. So we went through a very saintly period. The president made this extraordinary announcement, was, I think, quite rightly lauded by many sectors, including the media, for having taken initiative, for having acted ahead of the curve, not waited till things got worse, and so on and so forth. And so it seemed to me that a lot of those first wave of stories were incredibly positive, rightly so, but almost willfully positive. We had to will the success of this, and not surprisingly, we were all suffering. Mary's already pointed out, journalists are among those. So the people writing the stories are themselves among the group who are sitting at home, frustrated, running out of alcohol, not able to buy cigarettes, not able to see their friends. All of the frustrations that we've all suffered from. And then we got through the saintly phase, and now we're in the sinners phase. So now everything that everyone does is wrong, and of course, quite a lot of it is highly problematic. Some of the decisions made, some of the ways in which government have acted. I suspect also some ways in which corporates and NGOs have acted. We've not been faced with a lot of criticism in the media, at least not yet. But the recognition that the media's role to hold those in power to account is really important, and that needs to be the next step. And I can't help feeling that consumers of media then get swung backwards and forwards on that pendulum. They're not quite sure whether to be proud of what's been achieved and to praise the government, or to be ashamed of what's been done and to see everything as being a disaster. And of course, it's between the two. That's the case always. It's made more problematic because the whole nature of this virus and the fact there's so much we don't know, and there's so much that is really trial and error, only reinforces a situation in which there's a lot of grey in the middle. And unfortunately, the tendency of media may be to tend towards a black or a white position. And even if the media don't, the consumers of media would much rather consume a black or a white position, if you pardon the use of color to describe that. I mean, the either everything's good or everything's bad position. Because this is complex, and people don't like complexity, and don't like to consume complex news. And I think that's one of the reasons why the fake news or the false news does so well, is because it tends to be very simplified. And people would rather believe something that's simple and not question whether it's true or not, than be told something which is much more complex and be left at the end of that more confused than when they started, but actually probably better informed.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a good point there about sort of the simplification of information. And I want to ask specifically how the media is reporting on what is a complex issue, which is homelessness and people in need. How is that being picked up by media in South Africa, in your estimation?
Well, if I look across the way the media's covered the story across the whole country, and I'm part of the National Homeless Network, so I'm touching base with my colleagues in other cities on a regular basis. I hear what's happening on the ground, and then I see what's reported in the media. And what we've ended up in the media, and I have to completely confess that we are partly responsible for one end of that, is that a Durban is good story, everyone else is bad, is what's come out. And there's some elements of truth in that. Durban or eThekwini acted faster, acted more decisively than any other municipality, did more, spent more, probably spent a lot of money it shouldn't have spent. And we, as I say, we're part of the story. I'm not just consuming the story. I've been driving that story in Durban. So it has helped us from an advocacy point of view to present a very positive story about how the homeless have been treated in Durban. If you look at what's been said about the other cities, you'll see it's almost entirely a negative story. And that, again, there's a lot of truth in that. Some of the terrible mistakes made in Cape Town were absolutely awful, were completely avoidable. And it's right that the media have held the city of Cape Town to account. But then some of the good stuff that's happened in Cape Town or in Tshwane ends up not getting reported. But that's no different from any other situation we deal with.
Great.
I do worry about the missing stories. Sorry. I do worry about the missing stories.
Before you go on, I just want to acknowledge that we've got Pumeza from Durko who is watching this live, and she says, good morning. So people are watching and listening. Go on, Judy.
Sorry. I do worry about the missing stories. You know, with the collapse of a lot of community newspapers and radio stations, especially in rural areas in the country, and also the fact that pretty much only the SABC has a really good rural footprint across all provinces, which thank goodness for that. But what has happened, especially in print and in online to a certain extent, except for some publications that like Daily Maverick or others, or Amba Magani, that go deep into certain stories and features, is that we tend to have a very urban bias. And that's a traditional historical thing. And that means we're missing a lot of the stories that are happening in rural areas, especially areas that are more inaccessible. Mary will remember when we were both news editors in the Durban SABC newsroom, how our reporters would have to go right out into, we'd go ourselves when we were reporters, and when we were editors sending reporters out, it would take a whole day to get to stories, right out past Ulundi or Jazini, to do a story that was really important and having impact. And often the team has to stay overnight because it's such a long way, and the roads are terrible. The cars would come back with burst tires and things like that. There are lots of challenges around getting those stories. The stories about school children having to get to school, crossing a river and flood every day to get to school because there was no bridge, for example. So there are gaps, and we're the first in the media to acknowledge that there are a lot more stories that are still untold. And it's really important that we try to spread the net, as it were, and just do the best we can to tell those missing stories. And often it's women's voices, children's voices in communities that are really disadvantaged that can get forgotten.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Mary, did you want to add to that before I move on to some questions that have come in?
Thanks, Felix. I think it's important to understand the makeup of the landscape. Certainly, given the uncertainty, as I said earlier, of the pandemic, its consequence and its makeup, there will be a huge expectation for media to be all things to all people. That is an impossibility. Media cannot do that. What we need to understand is that the pandemic, the lockdown, and the different scenario of where society is, i.e., we're working from home, we all now have access to online. It shows that people have a grasp to now become information bearers, information disseminators, as well as consumers of information. So the public now also plays an important role in that realm. From that perspective, I think it's the journalists find themselves in a situation where, for instance, Judy mentioned what the public mandate will be for the SABC. But then you may have a commercial entity that has a different scenario of audience, and they have to look at it from a different position. And then you're going to have other independent television, radio stations looking at the story from other narratives and other viewpoints. The important thing to understand is that in the South African situation, fundamentally journalism is protected by the Constitution. And that means the quest for credible news is governed by, in print, self-regulation, In broadcast, you've got the BCCSA, and online, you've got the press ombudsman. So those entities are making sure that the information that comes out is correct, is accurate, and that the media is held accountable. Similarly, the veracity of the news, the way in which it's changing, means that media now has to jump from one story to the next, which is why sometimes, as Judy said, there will be this gap in the stories from the far-flung areas. And I think that's where civil society plays an important role. And I think Raymond and his people are doing that tremendously, making sure that that narrative is getting out. So certainly we need a lot more of that going forward.
Great. We've got actually several
Absolutely.
questions that have come in. We've got a question from Paul that asks, how much has the homeless population grown during the pandemic?
That's a very interesting question. We don't know, because if I take Durban as an example, the people who were homeless at the beginning of the pandemic were all given the chance to enter into emergency shelters. So we removed people from sleeping on the streets, and during the curfew period up until the end of level 4, anyone sleeping on the streets would have been breaking the law anyway. What we've seen as the lockdown has continued is not an increase in the number of homeless people, although there has been, and there's been some particularly problematic cases in Durban of eThekwini municipality against the law, actually evicting people from properties and making them homeless, and that in itself is an important story to tell. But rather an increase, not just in homeless people, but in people who are hungry. So we've seen people who actually have places to stay, but are roaming the streets, are begging at robots and so on, because they don't have access to money. And part of the problem of that is that the mechanisms that the government has trumpeted for funding, both increases in grants have mostly happened, but the UIF special grant for the unemployed has not actually happened on any kind of major scale. So people who desperately just need cash to feed their families are unable to get that. So it's hard to say whether that's an increase in homelessness or just in people who are hungry.
Can I just add, I think how very important civil society and NGOs are to the media. We all have strong links with them, because through them, we find out where there are communities that are starving and highlight that. And the NGOs who are providing some food but not enough can get more support, for example. I think that network is really crucial. And that is helping to spread the media footprint across the country. And that's where civil society plays such an important role in being on the ground, and also making sure they have the links with journalists so that those stories can be told.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, we've got a question from Sam, who says, there was a recent uproar when a professor gave an interview to a media outlet, and the journalist was accused of not verifying what she had said. How do you balance reporting on a subject such as COVID-19 that is new, and making sure that journalists themselves have accurate information and are able to relay accurate information? What's that one?
Thanks, Felix. So let's look at that. I'm not going to go into the merits of that particular story, because I think there are differing views there. In terms of the fact-checking scenario, yes, there's many uncertainties about the pandemic. We've spoken about that. But I think what it does compel media, and it's compelled credible journalists to do, is to balance out the story as best as possible. So this means that the rules apply for the pandemic as well in the coverage of it, i.e. running stories that come from credible sources, balancing out the information that is received, and going for the experts. You would recall that there's been a variety of scientists being interviewed on the matter. And one of the things that SANEF has done, and certainly we've seen this help a lot, is that SANEF has been proactive in going to, for instance, government, and having a good relationship with the government information communication system, and the individuals there and the individuals in the presidency, to constantly ask for and show where there are gaps in the information passage to the media. further than that, we've seen journalists come up with incredible ways of telling the story. And most importantly, when we ask, and journalists will tell you this, the editors will tell you this, the same rules apply. Before you put out the story, make sure it's accurate, make sure that it's verified, and make sure that it comes from sources that are credible.
In addition, don't
Thank you.
forget that newsrooms have their own internal gatekeeping, and editors and news editors it has to go through a process, need to be checked by an editor, not only for veracity, but also if anything's missing or if something doesn't flow properly. And that covers print, broadcast, online, etc. So all those processes help to make the final story or feature more accurate and more diverse.
Could I
Please.
Could I just add a further aspect on that? One thing I've noticed with a lot of stories I've been involved in here is that I'll be speaking to a journalist and give an opinion about something or give some information about something, and they will seek to balance what I say, rightly so, by getting comment from the relevant part of government. And nearly always the story comes out saying, and nobody from government replied. And I think that's one of the big issues that we have across the board in this country is the failure of government media departments to take their job seriously, and either they avoid speaking to journalists, or they don't have anything to say, or they don't respond quickly enough. And unfortunately, as consumers of media, we kind of we almost get used to it, rather than seeing it as actually a failure on the part of government to accept accountability. So when maybe this is a very British cynicism, but when I see no comment from government, I always assume that means they're hiding something, or they've got, or the situation is worse than the other party has said. Whereas I suspect a lot of South Africans assume, oh, what a shame, they were really busy, they didn't get around to replying. And I think there's way too much benefit of the doubt is given to our silent government spokespeople.
Felix, if I can just add on that, I think it's important for all stakeholders to understand that the uncertainty about the pandemic is one thing, but making sure that you're communication smart and savvy is a completely different demand. So it does require a whole new positioning on how you communicate, how often you communicate, and what are the facts that you communicate. Because this is something that media will want. And media won't just want it from civil society, they'll also want it from government. And they won't want it in a week's time, they want it ASAP. So that is important. And that is the kind of deadline-driven information system that we require now more than ever.
If you look at the first 3 weeks of lockdown, both the president and our health minister in particular, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, they were doing regular briefings, especially Dr. Mkhize. Zweli was talking every day, everywhere, all over, a consistent, informed approach that I think helped the country a lot to for everyone in those first 3 weeks to accept the lockdown, even though it was hard, and realize why we needed it. And unfortunately, since then, it's all gone a bit higgledy-piggledy, and it would be really good if there was a more consistent communications approach from the Crown Council, with a lot more medical and health experts brought in too, to help explain things.
Great. Okay, we've got a statement which leads to a question. But first, I want to say we've got a comment from a man in Texas, Dallas, Texas, named Paul, who says, "Thank you for your answer, Raymond. Similar things in Dallas, Texas." So we've got an international audience, it looks like. Then we've got Motlatso, who says this: "I agree with Raymond. People relate more to a WhatsApp audio note that are untrue and could possibly cause panic, as it's easy to understand and is distributed via a channel they have access to." That leads to the question: so if it's the case that more and more people are turning to WhatsApp or any other social media platform for news, then doesn't it behoove media houses to then switch onto social media platforms to put out their information as the primary source rather than just sort of repost on that?
I think, Felix, there are various aspects to that particular scenario. If we look at what does the increase in the online quest for news tell us? It tells us that people are looking to credible news entities for information on the pandemic. So if we go back to the question, what does this mean for media? It does mean that media is compelled to put out information that is verified. In terms of where we stand regarding the public, I think now more than ever, the public has to also play its part in holding media accountable and making sure that the information that is coming through is credible, is factual, and to constantly engage. And where transgressions happen, to use the various platforms to go and talk about what's happening and what they're unhappy with. For instance, if a story comes out, there are channels for the public to go to, be it the press ombudsman and the other sectors of regulation. The other important thing for the public under the pandemic is for the public to understand that if there is no free flow of information, then what is the consequence for our democracy? What is the consequence if media is constantly under attack from trolls, from misinformation campaigns? Because as Judy pointed out, whoever's putting out this misinformation on the WhatsApp groups is doing so with an agenda. And therefore, it's up to the public to also be discerning and to make input that is credible and to take steps that make sure that it is getting the right information, the verified information.
Raymond, do you want to say something?
Yes, you were talking about sharing information. So I have a little bit of a gripe. The people generally around the world are not very good with numbers, not very good at understanding numbers, and not very good at taking number-based information and making use of it. And obviously, a lot of what drives what's happening with COVID is about numbers of cases, rates of increase, the R, all of this terribly, terribly complicated stuff. One of the key roles of media is to take that complicated stuff, not to simplify it so that it's meaningless, but to simplify it so it's meaningful. So one of the things which absolutely drove me mad at the beginning of this, and it's still happening, is the number of times a news item would say, and the highest number of cases are in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban. I said, well, of course they are, because they're the three largest cities. Of course they're the highest number of cases. So unless you relate the number of cases to the population in each place, you're not actually providing any useful information at all. And it seemed to me that you had government people producing reports which had numbers in, but not very intelligent numbers, and journalists who just took those numbers and relayed them and didn't do any basic kind of analysis. I'll give you a very good example. I mentioned earlier about the spend on the homeless emergency shelter project here in Durban. So it has been an excellent project. Last week, the CFO of eThekwini was talking about how much the government had spent on various COVID-related issues, and he said, and so this is his number, that the eThekwini had spent 92 million rand on the emergency project for the homeless in Durban. And I sat up in my chair and thought, well, that's interesting. First of all, I've not seen a penny of that. So I wonder what they spent 92 million on. And then I did a really simple piece of maths. I took the 92 million, I divided it by the 1,500 people we have in shelters and the number of days they've been in shelters, and worked out that was 1,000 rand per person per day. And I want to know, why was the journalist who was sitting in that press briefing not immediately say, but hang on, Mr. Kumar, you've just said you spent 1,000 rand per homeless person per day for 8 weeks. Can you explain what you spent it on? But instead, the number just gets relayed as if it's something to be proud of. It's proud that we've done, we should be proud that we've done something very good to help homeless people in Durban, but we should be deeply embarrassed if it's cost us 1,000 rand per person per day, because that's not sensible spend. That's clearly ridiculous levels of spend, and one needs to ask questions about what that is. So these kind of simple ways of taking bits of data and using them to interrogate has not been happening. I fear it's because we have journalists who are themselves not very confident about managing numbers, so they just relay the numbers that they're given by government spokespeople who also either don't know how to manage numbers, or if they do, they're managing them in a manipulative way.
Felix, if I can just answer that, also contribute to that. I think what Raymond's raising is probably the exception rather than the norm. It really depends on who the journalist is, how young, how inexperienced, but not to deter from the fact that media should take very seriously the numbers game and unpack it in digestible form and manner. One has to also understand that under COVID, there's enormous pressure, and this is no excuse. So, what my sense would be when you do have expert comment like that, then it's important for nonprofits, for the NGO sector, for civil society to be constantly engaging with the journalists and with the media around those specifics and to bring it to the attention. Because you sit in one press conference, you cover the story, and the next thing you're covering up to 4 to 5 stories a day. That is absolutely no excuse for the numbers not being properly fed back to the community or given in its most simplistic form. But it does mean that we need to open the channels of engagement more regularly. There will always be gaps in the reporting. There will always be more areas for improvement. So from that perspective, I would encourage more engagement so that these kinds of stories are put further at the top of the agenda rather than somewhere in between.
Something that has added to this challenge is that so many newsrooms, because they've shrunk so much over the past 10 years, even before COVID, have lost the luxury, if you like, of having beat journalists or specialist journalists. So you get even young reporters coming in, throwing at lots of different stories simply because the stories need to be covered. And they can cover anything from crime to health to court, so many different things. And they're not, at a young age, not going to be good at doing everything at that stage, even with a good editor, because everything happens so fast. Not only do they have to provide the news for the newspaper, radio station or TV station and online, but also for social media posts. At the SABC, in addition, a lot of the journalists work in at least 2 languages. So they have an awful lot they've got to get through. Sound bites for the radio news bulletins, in-depth story for the special report, the in-depth programs, maybe a TV soundbite, something for Facebook, something for Instagram. I mean, there's just so much, and then other languages as well. So it is a challenging environment and quite daunting. Luckily, we do have lots of courageous journalists and hardworking ones, and hopefully we're going to still have them in the future, and hopefully we're going to be able to sustain our media, because they are really important as a very important part of our democracy, so that people can understand your freedom. Media freedom is your freedom. It's not just the media's freedom. If you don't get access to information so you can make informed choices about your daily lives, then you're missing out on something important. Oh, can I just say quickly hi to Paul? Because I studied at Southwest Texas University in San Marcos. It's so nice to hear someone from Dallas. Brings back fond memories of my days in Texas.
Great. We've got a couple of questions related to the credibility of media and figuring that out. Anita writes, whilst trying to remain informed, I also want to guard against news overload. That being said, the different ways agencies communicate the news seems to cause confusion. How can the public best verify what is credible? Where can one report fake news so that it can be exposed as fake?
So we, at the start of our conversation engagement, Judy mentioned the Real 411 campaign. This is a civil society initiated working closely with the South African government. So there is that online platform. It's called the Real 411. The website is available, and it is run by the Media Monitoring Association South Africa. I sit on there as a reviewer as well. And basically, a lot of the fake news or the concerning aspects around what is construed to be misinformation is portrayed through this particular channel and portal. And that's where the reviewers will sit, verify it, and then either say it's fake. If there are complaints that need to be channeled to the regulatory bodies who regulate media, in fact, it is channeled there. But also what's happening regularly is that people who do see information that they find questionable, they're also prepared to pick up the phone and chat to the editors and the journalists concerned. So that is that needs to be done. We need a lot more of that, and that in a way holds the journalist and the media accountable. But I also think it's incumbent on people themselves that there is a way of finding out, what are credible sources of information, because the patterns of how and the trends of how media entities report will tell you whether they're mouthpieces for political agendas or whether they're really there to cover credible and ethical news. And I think that's something that the public has to be also very mindful of. Thanks.
Great. Well, I just want to say thanks to all of our viewers. We're getting a lot of questions. We're going to the last 10 minutes here. I'm going to ask a question that came in from Sam, and it reads, SANEF has released quite a few statements concerning the financial difficulties faced by many media companies due to COVID-19. And there have been a lot of closures of companies such as Associated Magazines, and Caxton has also announced closure of several titles. How do you think media companies can weather the storm? And do you think government is doing enough to support the media sector in this regard?
So on that particular study, absolutely, Sam, it's not a very pretty picture going forward. So what SANEF has done, I'll give you a proactive approach and response to what is being done at the moment. So SANEF looking at two options here. The first thing is obviously to look at a kind of funding platform and funding initiative to assist those particular journalists. The second initiative is a long-term one, and therein lies the challenge for not just government, but for the entire country. And that is, how do we go forward, making sure that we have sustainable media? Because at the moment, the fall in the economy has impacted on the sustainability, which is why we've had all these many cuts. So from a government perspective, you would recall SANEF did have the engagement with President Cyril Ramaphosa. There, our chairperson brought to his attention the dire situation of the media industry as a whole. He has welcomed engagement with SANEF going forward. If you look at the stimulus funds that government has made available, no, not enough has gone the way of the media. So from that perspective, there needs to be this urgent engagement with government perhaps preparing a response approach to say, if we are setting aside funds, this is what will be made available, and then engage with SANEF on how these funds can be accessed. It also means that private sector has to come to the party as well to make sure that there's sustainability. From how and what should media companies be doing at the moment, certainly my position has been that rather than cut back on the jobs, let's look at initiatives, i.e. the trimming of salaries, making sure that there is a kind of equitable approach so that everybody gets something rather than some getting everything and others nothing. So that seems to be the approach that's been going forward. Obviously, the best case scenario is try not to retrench, but rather look at alternatives, whether it is people working to, part-time and making sure that that those who are on full-time employ are being used adequately. And if you look at the salary trims, making sure that it's across the board, not just a top-heavy approach. So these are some of the interim measures. But going forward, the conversation has to be held about how media can be made to be sustainable and what recourse and measure we look at.
There is a glimmer of light for some of the online publications like Daily Maverick and Amabangani, because they are donor funded or member subscription funded. And they've had a huge increase in their in people going online to see their news. And that is the fact that they've been donor funded over a longer period of time or member subscription has helped them to survive and to thrive, actually. And you may find some organizations going via a paywall, but there's a lot of resistance to that. People want to get their news for free, and then they might not, they might go to other sources that aren't credible to get it if they have to pay. So it is a real challenge. As Mary says, we as SANEF, we've commissioned new research into media sustainability and what some of the innovative approaches could be.
Okay. All right, we've got this question from Lisa. She asks, How do we as journalists rebuild the trust with our communities, especially as fake news continues to be prevalent?
Again, it's absolutely imperative that when there are transgressions and when fake news dominates the agenda, that there's a lot of lobby, not just from the public sector, but also from the media watchdog entities. And certainly we've seen this in South Africa when there have been transgressions against the journalists, whether it's ground troops or whether it's from trollers on social media. And I think if you look at America and what's been happening at the moment, given the death of George Floyd, you see a lot of the entities talking about the need for credible news, the need for the protection of the news entities and for journalists themselves. Because I think you've recorded some 400 abuses just affecting journalists, according to US formats and lobby groups. So it's important to track these sources, be it farming platforms that put out the information, and to look at, and when the trolling happens and when there's evidence of these kinds of misinformation platforms emerging, then it's up to the public to also bring it to the attention of those credible entities that fight against these kinds of initiatives. And going forward, we're going to be seeing a lot more of it. We've seen a lot of it happening the world over. We've seen it being spewed out of the mouths of certain individuals and leaders at all levels. So literally, vigilance, vigilance, vigilance on all fronts.
We have seen an interesting new trend among some regional newspapers in that they've been moving away from a lot of the COVID stories because that's been covered elsewhere so much, and focusing on community issues and community human interest stories. And those are the ones that seem to be attracting interest now from communities, things that affect them, something in their own road or street. Uplifting stories about nature or about new things that are happening. And I think people are going to need that more. We're going to need to provide more human interest stories that are uplifting and inspiring to balance out a lot of the negativity.
Yeah, thank you. We're in the final stretch of our program here. I want to say thank you again to our participants, our viewers. The questions were great, and I think we got some really good answers. I'm going to now hand it back, starting with Raymond, to our panelists for just sort of some final statements if they want to make to wrap this up, and then I'll close after we've heard from Raymond, Mary, and then Judy. Go ahead, Raymond.
I'd like to actually just pick up on the comment that Judy just made. We all need to get through this psychologically. So yes, it's important that we get good, clear information. It's also important that we are inspired and invigorated and motivated to carry on. And some of the work that that journalists have done, obviously I know the ones have worked with us, but they've worked with other communities across the country, have been fantastic. So if I can plug, for example, an excellent piece produced by Daily Maverick, in which a local Durban storyteller spent time with some of the guys in the lockdown shelters, interviewing them, photographing them, sharing their stories. And there are plenty of examples of this kind of work around the country. So one of the big advantages of this whole period has been an opportunity to reflect, an opportunity to pause. And I hope we come out of this as individuals and as a nation with a greater warmth and a greater sense of fellow feeling towards each other. And some journalists have been phenomenally good in pursuing that agenda. So many thanks to them.
Great.
Thanks, Felix. To wrap up, I think we've had exceptional pockets of excellence under the COVID trajectory from a media perspective. We've seen journalists do incredible work under very trying and testing circumstances. Certainly, there will be areas of improvement, and that is something I think the media is very mindful of. On the whole, my concern going forward is obviously what happens when credible media finds itself in the doldrums of the economic downturn. because that has significant overtures and consequence for the flow of information. If you have a dent in credible media, then the free flow of information is dented. And that is where the public has to be part of the solution as well. Because the question asked was, what happens when the trust in the media wavers? And this could lead to that. And that can be a very worrying future scenario we face if we've left just with well-resourced, deep pocket media entities that can only speak the language and kowtow to certain positions of power. So we need to make sure that as consumers of news, as members of the public, there is some kind of accountability taken as well to find solutions to make sure that sustainability and the life of media is held long and firm and credible. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Felix. And we hope the new normal is going to be a better normal. South Africans are very resilient and have been through a lot of trauma in the past. This is a traumatic time, but hopefully we'll come out more innovative, more resilient, and in a better world.
Great. That's a wonderful way to wrap up. Again, thank you to our participants and our viewers. It's been a great session. If you want to share this, it will be available as a recorded link on our U.S. Embassy South Africa Facebook page. Please do stay in touch. We have lots of other programs coming up. But with that, I want to say, Siyabonga kakhulu. Ambani kahle.
Thank you.